All right, so today we're diving into something kind of different. You know, when we think about mission work,
Right.
we often picture like
Yeah.
far off places, different cultures,
Totally.
maybe a jungle or a remote village. Right?
Yeah, that's the classic image.
But what if I told you that the mission field could be, well, a lot closer to home than you think?
Interesting.
Today, we're going to explore exactly that idea
Yeah.
through the experiences of one missionary
Yeah.
who kind of had his whole perspective on mission completely reshaped right here in the U.S. We're going to be looking at an excerpt from Mission Comes Home by Andrew Jones.
Interesting.
And his story is, it's
Right.
pretty fascinating. It really makes you rethink what it means to engage with different communities and how faith can play a role in that.
So we're talking about missions, but not necessarily
It's-
in the traditional sense.
Not in the, like, pack your bags and go overseas kind of way.
Okay.
More like recognizing the opportunities
Right.
for connection and service that are all around us, maybe even in our own backyards, you know.
I like that.
So whether you've ever considered going on a mission trip or you're just curious about how different cultures and beliefs intersect, or even if you just enjoy a good story about someone's personal journey, taking some unexpected turns, I think there's something here for everyone in this deep dive.
Definitely.
We're going to trace Andrew Jones's path from his early days as a missionary overseas to his work starting Christian communities in some pretty unexpected places right here in the West.
So let's start at the beginning. What was his initial vision of mission work?
So Jones's journey actually begins with a pretty strong conviction to be a lifelong overseas missionary. He was super involved with Operation Mobilization, and he spent time on the MV Logos, which was this ship that sailed around the world with a library and a crew of volunteers doing all sorts of aid and outreach work.
Really hands-on.
Yeah. Totally. It sounds like that experience in Latin America really shaped his initial understanding of what mission work meant. You know, that classic idea of going to a different culture to share your faith and help people.
So it sounds like he was all in on that path. Like, that was the plan.
Yeah, he even talks about giving up what he called small ambitions to pursue this calling. Like, he sold his car for a one-way ticket.
That's commitment.
Yeah, it's a pretty powerful statement.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
But then things start to shift when he moves to the USA, gets married, and finds himself kind of stuck on the home front in Southern California. He was still passionate about mission work, but he felt this tension between that calling and where he actually was.
Well, yeah, that disconnect between where you feel you should be and where you actually are.
It's like he was pulled in one direction by his calling.
Exactly.
But then life kind of put him in a completely different context.
Yeah, and that happens to a lot of people, I think, in different ways. Like, you have this vision for yourself, and then circumstances change or things don't go as planned.
And that can be really disorienting.
Totally.
But that's where he has this really significant realization.
What's that?
He says, and this is a quote, "Our call to mission was more about obedience than geography."
So it's not about the location.
Exactly.
It's about following that inner call.
It's not about being in a specific place. It's about responding to what you feel called to do, regardless of where you are.
That's a pretty powerful shift in perspective.
A huge, right?
Yeah.
And it really changes how you see the possibilities for mission work.
Yeah.
You know.
So how did that new understanding start to play out in his life? Did he just stay feeling lost, or?
He didn't just sit around, that's for sure.
Okay.
He and his wife, Debbie, they started actively living out their faith right there in Southern California.
Right.
They hosted international students, got involved with local church outreach, even had conversations about their faith.
Okay.
In places you wouldn't really expect, like in bars or just out on the street.
Wow, so taking it beyond the traditional church setting.
Exactly. They were really trying to meet people where they were at, you know. And this led to something pretty interesting. They started an alternative church gathering that was modeled on a coffee shop.
Oh, wow, like a more relaxed,
Yeah.
informal atmosphere.
Totally. And this was back in the late 80s, so pretty ahead of its time, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
They were recognizing that not everyone felt comfortable
Right.
or connected to the traditional church setting, you know?
Yeah.
So they were looking for new ways
Okay.
to build community and share their faith.
So it sounds like they were finding their groove with this new way of doing things.
They were. But then, in the early 90s, they got invited to go back overseas on another ship.
Oh, wow.
The MV Doulos. It was similar to the Logos, focused on aid and outreach.
Interesting.
And they were pretty excited about this chance to go back to what maybe felt like real mission work to them at the time.
Yeah, like that initial vision coming back around.
Yeah, it shows how deeply ingrained that idea can be, right?
Totally. Like, right.
Mission work equals going overseas.
But then, another twist, Debbie became pregnant with their third child.
Oh.
And suddenly, their family was too big for the ship's cabin.
Oh.
So that door closed.
Wow. So what happened then?
It's almost like something else was meant to happen.
It's interesting.
Because this is when they get sent to San Francisco in 1994 by their church in East Los Angeles, the church on Brady. But they weren't sent to a typical missionary posting, you know. They were specifically asked
to start Christian communities among what they called postmodern subcultures.
Postmodern subcultures. What does that even mean?
It's a pretty broad term, right?
Yeah.
But they were talking about groups like street kids, young people struggling with drug addiction, those involved in the goth, punk, rave scenes, hippie culture, cyberpunk, even this emerging online geek culture that was just starting to take shape.
To a lot of different groups with different interests and
backgrounds, a real mix of people. So when they say postmodern subcultures, what kind of common threads do you think tied those groups together?
Well, I'm thinking maybe a sense of being on the fringes of mainstream culture, maybe questioning traditional authority, exploring different values and ways of living.
That makes sense. And Jones emphasizes that for him and Debbie, this wasn't about targeting some other group. You know, he says they were not a demographic to us. They were people, and they were our friends.
So it was about genuine connection, not just some kind of project.
And they really put their money where their mouth was, so to speak.
How so?
They actually moved into the Anil. And Haight-Ashbury lived among these communities. Jones even says they became our tribe.
That's a pretty powerful statement.
Right. It's like that idea of really embedding yourself within a community, understanding their world from their perspective, almost like living as they do.
Some people call that incarnational ministry. It's about being present, sharing life, not just preaching from a distance.
It's a pretty different approach to mission work than what we usually think of.
So how did it go? Did they find it easy to connect with these groups?
Surprisingly, no.
Yeah.
In fact, Jones says that being a missionary in the USA felt more difficult than his time in Latin America.
That's surprising.
Yeah.
You'd think
the
shared culture would make it easier.
Right.
Yeah.
But he talks about how a lot of the young Americans they met saw churches as completely irrelevant. They had negative experiences with Christians. Felt like they were angry and weird, he said.
So there was already a lot of baggage and preconceived notions.
Yeah, it's like no matter how well-intentioned the message it was, getting filtered through these negative experiences.
Makes sense.
And Jones includes this quote from Miriam Adeney that really gives context to these criticisms. She talks about how Christianity is often seen as contributing to things like patriarchal sexism, ecological damage, racism, fostering low self-esteem, and repression of emotion.
Yeah, those are some heavy criticisms. It's not just about a few bad experiences. It's like systemic issues.
So faced with this kind of resistance, they had to get creative, right? Jones talks about collaborating with older urban churches, but realizing that new wineskins were needed for new wine.
I like that analogy, like the old ways of doing church might not be the right container for reaching these new groups.
And that's when they started seeing these new church movements emerge. Not trying to force people into existing structures, but creating something new alongside these new believers.
So meeting people where they were at, both literally and figuratively.
Yeah, there's this quote from Dan Kimball that I think sums it up perfectly.
What's that?
He says, "They liked Jesus, but not the church."
So there was a desire for the core message, but maybe not the traditional way it was being presented.
It's like they were looking for something authentic. Something that resonated with their experiences, but they weren't finding it in the traditional church setting.
Interesting.
And Jones started connecting with other people around the world who were doing similar things, what he called missional entrepreneurs.
So it wasn't just an isolated phenomenon.
No, it was like there's this widespread, almost organic movement happening.
Yeah, like a shift in the air.
And these new communities were springing up in all sorts of unconventional places.
Like where?
Coffee shops, homes, bars, even businesses. What Jones calls third spaces.
Right.
That weren't quite church in the traditional sense.
I guess that makes them less intimidating, maybe.
Yeah, more accessible, more neutral.
Yeah.
And a lot of them were led by lay people, too.
Okay.
With a more grassroots, bottom-up leadership style.
So less hierarchy.
Exactly. He even compares them to a colony of ants.
Huh. Interesting image.
Right.
Yeah.
Self-organizing, growing naturally,
yeah.
adapting to the environment. So pretty vivid way to describe these kinds of decentralized communities.
So what about those labels we talked about earlier?
Yeah, so of course people started trying to put labels on this movement. Things like Gen X, missional, emerging, emergent, postmodern.
Mm-hmm.
And Jones acknowledges that while those terms were maybe helpful at first, they quickly became problematic because they led to misunderstandings and suspicion.
Yeah, I can see that happening, like people getting hung up on the label.
Right.
Instead of actually engaging with the substance.
It's like the reality of these diverse communities was way more complex than any single label could capture.
Definitely.
But what Jones emphasizes is that in a lot of ways, these new communities were actually quite simple. Almost like a return to the basics of what the early church might have been like.
Interesting. What makes you say that?
Well, think about it. A strong focus on community, sharing meals together, more participatory style of worship, reaching out to those outside the existing group. These are all things that are often associated with the early Christian communities.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And he talks about how church life in the urban West became very modular. Yeah, like made up of all these different pieces. Communities, conferences, blogs, projects. It's a much more fluid and interconnected scene than just a single self-contained church.
So more like a network than a building.
Exactly. Yes. It's like people were finding different ways to connect and express their faith outside the traditional structures.
Interesting. So did Jones and Debbie stay in San Francisco?
They didn't. In 2000, they moved to Europe.
Okay.
And this is where things get really interesting. Because Jones found even greater resistance to the gospel there.
Really?
Than he did in America or Australasia.
Wow, that's saying something. I mean, Europe has such a long Christian history.
Right. But it seems like for a lot of people there, that historical connection to a lived faith has really weakened.
Yeah, like it's become more of a cultural artifact than a living reality for many.
He quotes Leslie Newbigin, who was a missionary who spent years in India and then came back to the UK and was kind of shocked by what he found.
What did he say?
Well, he called the UK a post-Christian culture, and he was pretty critical of how missiology at the time was largely ignoring the modern West.
So he saw the West as its own mission field, in a way.
Exactly. It's like everyone was focused on going overseas, but they were overlooking the fact that there was a huge need for a new way of thinking about and engaging with faith in these increasingly secularized societies.
Interesting. So after all these different experiences and different cultures, what were some of the core principles that Jones took away about mission work?
Well, he highlights three main ones.
Okay, let's hear them.
The first is obeying Jesus. And he specifically points to the instructions in Luke 10 about finding the person of peace, going to where people are, focusing on what's happening in their lives, entering new situations as someone who is there to learn and serve, not as someone who has all the answers.
So humility is key.
Yeah, and he even calls this approach post-colonial mission.
Post-colonial mission, what does that mean?
It's about moving away from that model where the missionary comes in as a representative of a dominant culture, bringing resources and solutions. Instead, it's about listening, recognizing the value and agency of the people within the community and working alongside them.
So more of a partnership than a top-down approach.
The second principle is imitating Paul, which he breaks down into this PAT model.
P-H-E, what's that stand for?
It stands for prayer, herald, apostle, teacher.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break that down for me.
All right, so herald is about sharing stories, using creative expression to communicate. Apostle is about starting new things, initiating new structures. Teacher is, well, teaching passing on knowledge and expertise.
So it covers a lot of ground?
Yeah, it's pretty comprehensive.
Mm.
But he also puts it in a simpler way. Make friends, tell stories, throw parties, give gifts.
I like that. It's very down to earth.
Right.
It emphasizes the relational aspect.
And the third principle is holistic mission.
Holistic mission. Okay.
He references Tom Wolfe, who said that business is becoming a key platform for mission in the 21st century.
So bringing faith into the marketplace.
Yeah, and Jones points out all these historical links between missions and business.
Like what?
Well, you have the Apostle Paul, who was a tent maker.
Right.
You have monastic movements that were involved in agriculture and crafts. The Moravians, who were known for their businesses. William Carey, who was a missionary and a botanist.
Okay.
Henry Venn, who advocated for self-supporting missions. And then you have the more recent rise of for-benefit businesses and social enterprises.
Yeah, businesses that are designed to do good.
Exactly, to address social needs while also being financially sustainable. Jones even talks about his own experience starting a cooperatively run studio and store.
Wow.
That was a hub for creativity, business, and community, kind of like a modern-day version of those early Celtic monks.
So integrating faith and work.
It's not about compartmentalizing those different parts of life.
Right.
But finding ways to bring them together.
Yeah, that's a really relevant idea for a lot of people today.
And finally, Jones acknowledges that this is all a learning process. You know,
of course, yeah.
There are going to be mistakes along the way, especially with how quickly the world is changing.
You have to be adaptable.
He also mentions David Bosch, a missiologist who had some really interesting thoughts on the future of mission.
Like what?
Well, Bosch emphasized the importance of environmental awareness.
Okay.
Being a countercultural voice without withdrawing from the world.
Right.
Working together across different Christian traditions, being relevant to local contexts, empowering everyday believers, and living out faith in credible ways within local communities that actively engage with the surrounding culture.
So it's a pretty holistic vision.
Yeah, it's not just about preaching a message. It's about living out your faith in all areas of life and working to make a positive impact on the world around you.
So, to sum it all up, Andrew Jones's story really challenges our traditional understanding of mission.
It's not just about geography, right?
Right. It's about being open to where you feel called to serve. Recognizing the opportunities for connection and understanding that are all around us. And being willing to adapt and innovate in how we build those connections.
And maybe even more importantly, it's about seeing people as people.
Right.
Not just demographics or projects.
It's about building genuine relationships.
And with that in mind, we want to leave you with a final thought.
Okay.
Considering Andrew Jones's journey, where might you see opportunities for connection, understanding, or even mission in your own community that you might not have noticed before?
That's a good question.
How can we take these ideas of being a herald, an apostle, or a teacher and apply them in our own daily lives, regardless of our backgrounds or beliefs, to build bridges and create deeper understanding with the people around us?
It's definitely food for thought.
It is. It's something to really consider.
Thanks for diving into this with me.
Yeah, this was a great conversation.